So imagine you're getting all settled into your seat, nice and cozy. Maybe you're at the theater, maybe you're at the book tour of your favorite author.
Or maybe a TED Talk.
When you're getting settled in, you notice there's a sign language interpreter at the front. How many of you saw that and thought, this is gonna be really cool? Sign language is so beautiful, and got a little more cozy, right? Sign language, yes, for sign language. Sign language is beautiful, let me tell you. And the interpreting process is absolutely cool. But interpreters are not performers. Interpreters are an important part of accessibility and inclusion. And think about the deaf people that are there. They're the ones that requested the accommodation, but they rarely get the same attention in those kinds of spaces. Being an interpreter is not glamorous. It's actually very, very, very hard work. And just as much as it is our job to provide our skills to the deaf community, it is equally, if not more important, for us to work alongside hearing people like yourselves who do not know American Sign Language and often need crucial information from deaf or hard of hearing people. A doctor needs to know exactly what's wrong with their patient. A teacher needs to know that their student comprehends all lectures and homework. An interpreter in those situations is given a lot of trust to facilitate all of those dynamics effectively.
According to the 2011 American Community Survey, roughly 11 million individuals consider themselves deaf or have serious difficulty hearing. Many of these people identify culturally as deaf with a capital D, not hearing impaired. Deaf people as a cultural identity are richly diverse, and today they are making strides in every field, developing new medical advances and inventing new technologies. They are lawyers and CEOs and political candidates, and they are revolutionizing the idea of universal access. But if certified, qualified interpreters are not provided alongside other forms of accommodation, then there's an issue.
You're missing out on 11 million game changers, revolutionaries, coworkers. Here's the thing. Historically, ASL interpreters were just friends and family members. The children of deaf adults, or CODAs, were often the ones responsible to facilitate language for their family. Other people were just friends who happened to know the language and had a big heart. And our career is still very young. American Sign Language didn't even start to be recognized as its full-own autonomous language until the 60s. And interpreters didn't start receiving any sort of training until the 70s. Those programs were typically only a few weeks long and focused on vocabulary building, but there was very little discussion on the vicarious effects that the interpreting process can have on the interpreter and how serious the consequences can be, mostly on the deaf and hard of hearing community, when those language facilitators are ineffective.
A hearing interpreter strives to neutrally and judiciously facilitate both cultural and linguistic intent between deaf and hearing parties. We are not just dealing with words, but the intent and emotion behind and around those words. We do not give a word for word or a watered-down summary of what someone is saying, but actually, sign language interpreting is mostly done simultaneously. So as you can see on stage, the interpreters are producing a linguistically, culturally, and dynamically equivalent message in American Sign Language, live, with just a few seconds of lag time. American Sign Language is rich with its own culture and grammar and regional accents, and it uses the face and the body to create richness and context that would otherwise be just a simple hand movement. It changes and flows with the culture around it, and in the case of simultaneous sign language interpreting, there are two processes happening in the brain: visual and auditory. According to studies, there are literally too many complex processes in simultaneous interpretation for even the world's best supercomputer to run at the same time. Interpreters must understand context along with tone, body language, facial expression, emotion, and produce a dynamically equivalent interpretation without disrupting the flow of conversation, no matter how intense it might get. Just imagine the difference between interpreting for an argument, versus a boring lecture. Or imagine the difference of an interpreter for President Obama compared to President Trump.
Today, interpreters are professionals that have to deal with all of that. We graduate from bachelor and master programs, and we are required to continue our education after that, going to workshops and engaging with the deaf and hard of hearing community, talking about research that comes out about our field almost every single day. We now realize that the interpreting process is incredibly nuanced and very complicated. There's vicarious trauma involved, power and privilege dynamics, and interpreters must be very cognizant of the effects that we can have on people's lives as we navigate those dynamics. Interpreters work in a variety of fields, so we're learning new things from the deaf community all the time and developing new types of interpreting, like pro-tactile interpreting alongside the deafblind community, or working alongside deaf people who are native speakers and act as certified deaf interpreters, adding cultural context that hearing people like ourselves typically are unable to produce. And while all of this amazing progress is happening, we still have a really, really long way to go. Certified does not always mean qualified, because agencies are still placing interpreters to match accommodation needs without directly asking deaf people what they need. An interpreter could show up and have no idea what we're doing, and that can have serious consequences on people's lives and can affect that interpreter. Everyone involved is at risk when that happens.
So overall, interpreters are called to work at a level that is both professional and ethical. This standard comes from our Code of Professional Conduct, or CPC, that works to set the standard for interpreting practices and keep certified interpreters working ethically. Certification alongside accountability systems like Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf protect working professionals as well as the rights of deaf individuals. However, the US currently has only one nationally accepted test to certify hearing people as American Sign Language interpreters. As of 2015, there is no nationally recognized exam for legal interpreters, and there has never been a nationally recognized exam for healthcare interpreters in the history of the profession. Another major problem is that some states, like Oregon, this national certification test is not mandated by law. So anyone who can prove they know sign language can potentially be hired by an agency and sent to work out with a deaf person, even in medical settings. Many agencies who contract interpreters cannot or do not effectively screen their interpreters for quality and skill. This lack of services can be worse in rural areas, like here in Central Oregon, where resources are already limited. Deaf people often have to choose between subpar access or no access at all, and then have no place to file a complaint that will actually make a difference.
When hearing people like ourselves are collaborating directly with the deaf community, we know how to use our privilege and our access to support deaf people's creation of inclusive spaces for themselves. When we are all included, everyone wins. For example, this could even be important in a community grassroots activist setting. Like in 2018, when I was called to serve by the deaf community at Occupy ICE PDX. For 38 days, protesters fought to shut down the DHS office in Portland and protested the separation of families and the abuses happening at the border. And as we all know, here in Oregon, political action like that is nothing new. But Occupy ICE PDX was very unique because for the first time, an entire camp in all its complexities was made accessible because deaf and hard of hearing community members and activists showed up and put themselves on the front line. And that camp kept its commitment to fighting for all people by providing sign language interpreters and other forms of accommodation and accessibility. I was fortunate enough to be involved and helped coordinate a team of roughly 10 sign language interpreters who showed up for vigils, direct actions, community meetings. We had interactions with armed officers, and we interpreted live arrests. This type of inclusion was new for deaf people and sign language interpreters. But what came of it was beautiful. New specialized vocabulary was discussed on by the deaf community for the first time ever. That language empowered them to create their own narrative in those spaces and helped interpreters like Lauren and I know exactly how to match those needs. When everyone is involved in that work, everyone wins. We're still doing that activist work today because of the creation of vocabulary and concepts that the deaf community were able to make for themselves, and not only just talk about the deaf experience, but be included enough to engage on any topic they wanted.
But let's be honest, the modern world revolves around auditory information gathering, and most people who have the privilege of hearing don't think twice about it and are able to partake at ease. There are many situations in which you may all have never thought about life from a perspective other than hearing. But I want you to take a moment and think back to your favorite class in elementary school. Or think back to your first job interview. Maybe a time you were scared to receive some news, or maybe your first court appearance for a speeding ticket. The birth of your child, or a funeral. Interpreters are often a rotating cast of strangers in these and so many other moments of deaf people's lives. Andrew and I have been those strangers in the room and those extra bodies and on the video screen. We are privy to stories that are not our own and experience moments in people's lives that we would never otherwise have knowledge of. Professional interpreters are called to work for respect for consumers and coworkers, while also prioritizing confidentiality and privacy. Those stories, good and bad, belong to the deaf community and are not for interpreters to tell.
That's right. The thing is, when you see an interpreter, we are not here to teach you cool signs or talk on the side. It's not a performance. We are working hard to provide accessibility to hearing and deaf people. The ADA states that places of public accommodation must allow people with disabilities to participate in and benefit from equally in any service. So, what is the best way for all of you to know that you're providing the right kinds of accommodations? You can start by researching locally. Start in the places that you work or places that you frequent. Are they able and ready to provide a number of access points, including sign language interpreters upon request? Also, please start to push your legislators to put certified, qualified interpreters into the legislation here and start demanding that that certification and that standardization make its way to Oregon. Also, find deaf organizations that are already doing that work and throw your full weight behind them, because those accountability processes must be in the hands of the deaf community.
But most importantly, ask deaf people, engage with them directly. Support deaf professionals and organizations that are already doing the work. Ask them what makes a good interpreter. Inspire them and empower them to give their own experiences and more of their own TED Talks. Our time on this stage has been an honor, but we want to be clear. Interpreters are only one part of the story, and only one option in a myriad of different kinds of accommodation and access. The work of an interpreter exists symbiotically with the deaf community, because if they are not empowered to regulate and educate and keep accountable the interpreters that you all depend on, then we as interpreters are not able to grow our field to match the ever-changing world. It is simple. The best way to ensure that your work is successful is to make that work accessible and inclusive.
And accessibility in itself is not revolutionary. But again, when everyone is involved, I think you'd be surprised at how extraordinary it could be. Please, don't just take our word for it. Go get yourself an awesome interpreter and ask the deaf community what they're already doing. Without that kind of accessibility, how would you ever know what you have been missing out on? Thank you.